Just a few announcements before we start tonight's event. Next week, on Monday of next week, Harrison Scott Key will return to Square Books. He's going to sign How to Stay Married, the most insane love story ever told. If you come to that event, I guarantee you will chuckle. And on Tuesday, June the 27th, S.A. Cosby, or Sean Cosby, will be here reading and signing All the Sinners Bleed. He's one of the hottest new noir writers out there today, and we're lucky to be able to have this be his second visit here. And I understand that we have no events in July. Is that right? We don't? Mm-mm. No events in July. That hasn't happened in a long time. But that's okay. We'll be doing something else. And in August, the only day we have booked so far is August the 15th. Michael Oher, y'all, you who are Ole Miss football fans know very well who he is. He'll be here with his second book, signing When Your Back's Against the Wall. So, but today we're here, and I'm lucky to be able to introduce Victor Lukerson. He's his book Built from the Fire, and I also he's based in Tulsa. He's a former writer at Time Magazine, and his work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker Magazine, Smithsonian, and Wired. He manages an email newsletter about unexplored aspects of Black history, and that's called Run It Back. I understand that today, and he will be in conversation with Ralph Eubanks, who, if I'm not mistaken, was here just last night. And thank you, Ralph, for doing this today. And then we have some special guests. The grandchildren of J.H. and Carly Goodwin, who are central characters in this narrative. And they are here today. And so Jim Goodwin and Jean Arredondo, if y'all would stand and be recognized, or you don't have to stand. But they're right here. They're right here on the front row. And they have more family with them, and I'm going to let y'all introduce them. Or do you want me to do that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Dr. Arredondo, that's my sister Jeannie's husband. Kathy Williams, I have my niece Jenny Jones, and Kaylee, who was a granddaughter, and then my niece Regina Goodwin. She's a state representative in Boston.
Thank you all so much for being here. This is a special day for us, and we appreciate you being here. Victor and Ralph, if y'all assume the positions.
I know I'm going to have to get a little bit close.
It's fairly close.
Yeah, so thank you all for coming. And if you have not received your copy of the New Yorker this week, you will see Victor's, in the Talk of the Town there, he actually has a Talk of the Town caricature as well, which looks amazingly like him. So it's just like he is here. And the cover of his book is there. It is the best marketing placement ever. As a writer, I am insanely jealous. As I was telling someone, I said, well, he's only in his early 30s. I was almost 60 before I got published in the New Yorker, and I didn't get to talk of the town. So thank you all for coming here, and welcome to Oxford, and welcome to the Goodwin family to Mississippi. So this is a real treat for me. I've been interested in Tulsa for quite some time. I visited there with my family when we were doing a westward trip. We were kind of doing a southern trip to the west on our way to Colorado, where my wife is from. So I want to start off with kind of the first chapter, which has a great title, and it says, "Do not hesitate, but come." And that's a great title. I want you to tell us a little bit about that. But you tell the story of James and Carly Goodwin, whose descendants are here today, who moved from Water Valley, Mississippi, just across the county line from here, of course. And James can pass for white. Carrie cannot. James feels limitations of what he can do in Mississippi as a black man, even one who looks white. By the fall of 1913, they decided they're going to move to Oklahoma. Can you just kind of tell us a bit about why you centered your story on this family? How did that story mirror that of other black migrants to Oklahoma?
Definitely, and thank you so much, everybody, for being here. This is actually my very first book, my very first book tour, my very first New Yorker cartoon. So it's a really exciting time for me.
Don't rub that in.
It's also such a pleasure to have the Goodwin family here. And I met these folks 5 years ago now, actually, when I met Regina Goodwin and Jim Goodwin. And it's been such an amazing time getting to know them and learn their story. You know, they often tell me that I know more about their family than they do in a little bit. And so some of the things I discovered are actually right here in Mississippi. You know, I came to Mississippi in 2019 on a reporting trip to Water Valley to sort of see what the place was like that their family had come from. Made a brief detour at Ole Miss actually for some research about Jim Crow, Mississippi. And, you know, one of the things that I sort of realized diving into that world was that the Goodwins and what they experienced was really emblematic of black people of that era. You know, it was really interesting to really understand the brutality of Jim Crow, Mississippi. You know, there's a story that Jim Goodwin, Mr. Goodwin, would always tell me about how when his grandfather, J.H. Goodwin, was walking down the street in Water Valley, as a black man, if a white man approached him, his job was to scurry in the gutter. That was what was expected. And that didn't happen, you know, he might be beaten or waylaid. And it's interesting because Jim told me this oral history, and I remember actually when I came to Ole Miss and did research, I found it in academic textbooks as well. So you sort of see both the oral history tradition of that story as well as sort of the documented academic version of it. And so, in terms of sort of why the Goodwins made sense to focus this book on, it's because that journey from Jim Crow, Mississippi to Oklahoma, that's something that thousands of families did at the time. You know, 1913 is really the origins of the Great Migration. That's the time period when black folks across the Deep South were traveling to places like Detroit, New York, Chicago. And so one thing I really liked about this story and about Oklahoma in general is it's almost like an alternate route, you know what I mean? I really like the idea of black people being plugged into that Western mythology we have. You know, there's a mythology in America about go Western, man, you know, seek a new future. And so that's really what J.H. and Carly did. And so I really love being able to capture that aspect of their story. So I think on one hand, there's that part of it where the family is really emblematic of a larger black and American story. But there's also something very unique about the Goodwins, which is how I entered their world, is because they're the last ones left on the block in Black Wall Street. If you go to Greenwood Avenue right now in Tulsa, and you'll see there's a baseball stadium there, which was kind of built to the protest of a lot of black folks in the community. There's high-rises there. There's a lot of stuff that really has nothing to do with Greenwood or Tulsa's black history. But there's also this old auto garage that's been repurposed into a newspaper office. I actually remember the very first time I went to the Oklahoma Eagle, which the family owns. So you have this big auto garage, right? And there's like an industrial entrance. And so I'd never been in the building before, and I thought this industrial entrance was the only entrance. But if you're on the back, there's like a normal like glass door office entrance, right? So I'm at the industrial entrance, calling Mr. Goodwin. He answers his phone. He's like, "Where are you?" I'm like, "I'm here." He's like, "No, you're not." I'm like, "I'm here though." So finally, he like busts through the industrial door, and he's like, "You're late." Oh my God, I'm already ruining my chance to like connect with his family. But luckily, Mr. Goodwin was really nice and like really shared his family story with me. Told me about J.H. and Carly and all they had gone through, and really kind of set me on this path from that first discussion we had at the Eagle office. So I think the fact that they are both emblematic of this universal black story of trying to seek a better life, but also very unique in that they were able to survive on that block against all these obstacles for more than 100 years, really made them the perfect people to focus on for this book.
I mean, I would also say that they're emblematic of the economic progress and independence that was made less than a century after emancipation. So, and reading this book, I couldn't help but think about W.E.B. Du Bois's 1900 Paris exposition on the American Negro, where he's showing these portraits of black progress across the country that he puts out in Paris, has all of these elaborate charts on kind of the economic development of black people at that time, and Du Bois was impressed by Greenwood. He said that it kind of fit his idea, what he thought would work for black people, which was this closed economic circle that led to black prosperity. And what I found interesting reading this book was there's this allusion to Du Bois' visit to Tulsa. There's this idea of the closed economic circle that's a part of this book, but then there's also the community school is named for Booker T. Washington. So how is this tension between the philosophies of Du Bois and Washington, how do you see that played out in Greenwood?
That's a great question. And for me, this book was in some ways like my own dissertation or like PhD program. Like instead of doing a PhD, I wrote a book. And so I learned a lot about that debate, Like I think, I'm from Alabama, right? And so that's where Booker T. Washington is from. And if you're from Alabama, all you really hear is the Washington side of it. You just hear about, Booker T. Washington, he was a great guy. He really advocated for black people, which is true. But you don't really get any of the nuance of how some people were sort of opposed to Washington's vision. And so I really, honestly, when I researched the book, I really started to sort of grasp the difference between the two. And so for people to understand the context, Washington and Du Bois were both very prominent black intellectuals and leaders in the early 20th century. And they really kind of had this sort of schism or division about what's the best way towards black progress. In Booker T. Washington's mind, the best way towards progress was essentially agriculture and entrepreneurship. If black people can till the land, start businesses, sort of prove their value in our economic system, then white people will sort of eventually open the door for them to have full rights. That was kind of the premise. Then Du Bois, on the other hand, said, we don't need to wait for white people to give us anything. We deserve these rights. It's in the Constitution. We've earned it during the Civil War. Y'all need to give us our rights right now, And so there was this sort of debate unfolding. What's interesting, though, is that both of them had a lot of admiration for Oklahoma. Washington visited Oklahoma in 1914 for the Negro Business League meeting in Muskogee, Oklahoma, and everybody who came to this meeting was kind of shocked that it wasn't just like cowboys and shacks. They were like, wow, y'all got some stuff going in Oklahoma. This is pretty cool. And that's kind of the feeling that they had at that time. Meanwhile, Du Bois came to actually visit Greenwood Avenue in 1921, and as you said, he was so impressed by the fact that black folks in this community were keeping the dollar circulating within their own stores, that in some cases they were even choosing to shop black instead of shop white when they had the option. And so for both those men, the place was really a place of prosperity and a vision, right? A vision of what black folks could have in the future. But I think that in Greenwood itself, one of my favorite discoveries actually when they named this school, the main high school in Greenwood is called Booker T. Washington High School. It still exists today. We have a lot of graduates from Booker T. actually in the Goodwin family. But when they named the school in 1913, it was a huge community debate. Are we going to do Du Bois? We're going to do Washington, actually. And so Washington wins out, and I think that's fascinating because, again, I'm from Alabama where Booker T. Washington angle and everything. So I kind of his mentality was just kind of absorbed in the background of my mind. I had to go out and find Du Bois' ideology because it was a part of the architecture of my world. So that's just a small example, I think, of how even something like naming a school really shapes the way people think. But for those folks, they really were kind of combining both the entrepreneurship of Washington with the activism and intellectualism of Du Bois. That was really kind of the Greenwood secret sauce.
Yeah, one of the places that you mentioned in Built from the Fire that I think is important both, I think just for the historically and metaphorically, it's the Dreamland Theater. And the description of it is so vivid in this book. And one of the things that I kept thinking about the Dreamland Theater kind of on fire. I couldn't get that image out of my mind. Could you just tell us about the theater and its significance for Black Tulsa?
Yeah, I mean, the Dreamland was honestly one of my favorite things to research in the whole book, and especially its owner, Lula Williams. I feel the easiest way to sort of unpack all of this is there's a very famous photo of Greenwood of a couple in like a really nice car, like a not a Model T, but like a nicer car than that. It's called a Norwalk car. So it's like the Rolls-Royce in 1910s or whatever. You know, how does this black couple get this car? This is so dope. And so it's the two of them and their son, WD, in the car. So Lula's in the passenger seat, and her husband John's in the driver's seat. And this photo kind of captures a lot of people's expectations of what life was supposed to be like. Well, of course she's the passenger, he's the driver. So Lula and John bought the Dreamland Theater property in the 1910s, and I spent a lot of time going through property records actually to do a lot of my research. So I found the document where they bought the theater together. They were both in the document. I keep looking through the documents about the Dreamland, and I found this next document that says, John Williams sells to Lula Williams the property for $1, his stake. I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder if they had some kind of legal arrangement. Maybe there's like a maneuver for like tax reasons. I don't know. So it's kind of interesting. Keep looking. Same property. An affidavit I find. Lula Williams filed this affidavit at the courthouse that said, I, Lula Williams, own the movie projector, the seats, the popcorn machine. I own all this stuff. My husband John has no rights, herein or unto. And I was like, wow, Lula, okay. Like, Lula was very serious about it, like this was her property. And it really disrupted that image that I had seen years ago that implied that Lula was subservient to John in some kind of ways. And so I love, there's a whole scene in the book about this, basically, and about how Lula, even when Dreamland was created, the white press and the black press both called her husband like the Negro Rockefeller. Her name not even in the articles. And I just imagine her just mad, just like stewing on it. Like, what am I going to do about this? And so she did something.
I was mad when I was reading it.
Yeah, she did something about it. You know, she claimed her property for herself. And so in terms of what the Dreamland actually was, what Lula created, it was both a space for community, entertainment, celebration, you know, vaudeville shows, the greatest films of the era. She had deals with Fox, Universal, all those kind of companies. But also they would have protests there, right? So they have protests against Jim Crow segregation in Oklahoma, in Tulsa. And so I love the idea of like black spaces that can be like multi-purpose. And I thought the Dreamland really represented that so well. It's very sad what happened. I think later we'll talk a little bit about trauma and the reactions after the massacre. So it's very sad what happened to Lula and the Dreamland. But in that early era of Greenwood, it really was kind of the marquee space for the community.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll kind of move on to the riots. And maybe for those who aren't familiar with the book, or maybe are not even familiar with the story of the Tulsa riots, what would you like kind of the audience to know about the Tulsa riots? And I guess maybe, is there something that you, in the course of this, that switched your point of view on the Tulsa riots itself? Mm-hmm.
Well, first thing I would probably say is that I think massacre is a more accurate term for just describing them. I know that we've had sort of riots have been in the lexicon for a very long time, but there's actually a sort of legal implication to that, because if something's portrayed as a riot, it's sort of thought of as a battle between two different sides. And actually in 1921, after the race massacre, insurance companies used that term riot to imply that, well, if there's a battle between two sides, we don't have to pay out our fire insurance claims to you. And so there's been a big advocacy in the community for the last few years to really focus on that word massacre instead. I would also say that I think, and I really only this all really clicked in my mind even like the last few months after kind of writing the whole book and seeing the whole picture. But I thought if anybody's heard anything about the Tulsa race massacre, you may have heard about like the white mob, you know? Like you may anybody watch Watchmen in here by chance? The Watchmen TV show? Mm-hmm. A couple people. So in that show, you'll see like people in Ku Klux Klan outfits burning down Greenwood and shooting folks and doing all this kind of stuff. And in a lot of if you read like a Wikipedia article about the race massacre, it'll say the white mob did X, Y, Z. But I feel like that even that terminology kind of implies we have this sort of like lawless, low class group of people who are participating that are separate from the good citizens of Tulsa. When in fact, if you go back and look at the photos of the race massacre, you'll see men in suits out there. You see men in police uniforms and National Guard uniforms. You'll see people from the highest seats of power in the community were participating in both the destruction of Greenwood and also an effort to seize the land afterwards. And so in the book, I go through great lengths to really explain both what these institutions were and sort of who these people were. There's actually a massacre descendant named John W. Franklin. He's a retired Smithsonian administrator. And so I did an event at the Smithsonian about 2 weeks ago. And I just love the way Mr. Franklin says this, because he'll call me sometimes. He was excited about the book as he was reading it. And he would call me, and he'd be like, Victor, you name names in this book. Nobody does that. You name names. And he was just so excited about the fact that we're getting past the mob. We're getting past, like, racism. There's, like, actual people who did actual things. And a lot of that's outlined in this book, which I think is what I want people to take away from it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that moves us on from just kind of the destruction and kind of the nature of the massacre itself to really the toll of the massacre, because we often think about Tulsa in terms of statistics. The property loss, and I guess were there like Sanborn fire insurance maps of Greenwood?
Oh, yeah.
So there's the physical human toll, the buildings. We talk about kind of the physical destruction, loss of physical space. How about the psychic toll? How is that psychic toll kind of echoed across generations of people in Tulsa?
Yeah, I think one of the things I noticed, I'm from Montgomery, Alabama, to be specific, and in Montgomery has a tortured racial history as well. But in Montgomery, it kind of feels like it's like America's history. Like Rosa Parks is America's history, and Dr. King is America's history. So I had no tangible connection to those narratives personally when I was growing up there. But now I came to Tulsa, and even going to like city council meetings or protests, it just felt like everything was so much more raw and intimate because there had never been a chance to properly excavate what happened, And even sometimes I'm just talking to folks in families involved and sort of having the trauma of what happened surface very suddenly. That happened while talking to people about what happened in 1921 and how no justice has ever been served for that atrocity. But also I think it's really important to understand that even in the immediate aftermath, as the community was rebuilding in such a resilient way, people were suffering. Lula Williams, who we discussed earlier, like the woman of Greenwood in my mind before the race massacre, she actually suffered symptoms very similar to PTSD afterwards. Had to be committed to a sanitarium. And so I kind of walked through her experiences in Greenwood or in Oklahoma simultaneous with this sort of rebuilding resilience narrative, I have a chapter in the book that's called The Myth of an Impervious People, because I don't really think it's fair that black people are, in our sort of American narrative, obligated to always be the strongest, the most resilient, the people who never suffer, or sort of get over their suffering. I think that's kind of our function in the American mythology. And so I was trying to puncture that a little bit. And so, I think I sort of in different ways go through those dynamics. I will say it's kind of interesting with the Goodwin family. So Jim and Mr. Hernando's father, Ed Goodwin Sr. was a high school senior during the race massacre. He was actually about to graduate high school days afterwards. They were literally decorating for the prom the night it happened. And it's really interesting because, I was able to listen to some oral histories he recorded and hear him talk about what happened. And he's very reticent to really get into it. You know what I mean? And he's not, it wasn't as if he's going to be saying like, oh, I have trauma, or, you know what I mean? But it's always like, talking about it with like a little joke, or talking about it in a way that's like a little bit, sort of like trying to diffuse what happened, I actually remember there's a recording of him in 1971 commemorating the race massacre, and he kind of tells this joke about it. But then he says, I really wish those white folks hadn't come in here, something to that effect. So you're kind of seeing, even with this guy, who's kind of like a man's man in some way, him sort of processing that in his own way. And so it's really interesting kind of understanding how that trauma impacted so many different people in so many different ways. And certainly, having lived there for a long time, I can see that the trauma still lingers for sure.
Well, I got a sense of how that trauma was there. It was, I would say, if you pick this book up and read it, you're gonna connect with that trauma. I think that's what I really did as a reader. It was a very emotional read for me. And that kind of leads to my next question, which you alluded to earlier. Is kind of these fictionalized depictions of the Tulsa race massacre, whether it's there was Watchmen, and wasn't there
Lovecraft Country.
Lovecraft Country, which I did watch. And you said history as written tends to be executed on black people rather than by them. And then you felt that Watchmen fell into that trap. So, as Tulsa gets translated into public memory, now that kind of can't be erased, so often what happens when these things become part of public memory, they get to be sanitized. So I guess how, as looking at this, I think that's really, you're from Montgomery. That's a place where, as you said, it's become America's story, but we've also become very divorced from that story because we're not really we don't see the connection. So how can you maintain the spirit of memory in Tulsa, one that is really rooted in trauma? How can you keep that alive so it's not really softened in the way that we think about this past?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really important question. It's something that I try to explore in the modern section of the book. The book kind of has an early section about early Greenwood and the race massacre, a second section about the rebuilding in mid-century, and a third section about what's gone on in Tulsa in the last 5 years or so. And so I think how can we sort of make sure we're not having a sanitized version of our past? I think that rejecting hollow symbolism is really important. There's a lot of hollow symbolism in Tulsa. I've never really been anywhere that had so much. Just as an example, if you go to Greenwood Avenue today, there are plaques in the sidewalks that denote a lot of the buildings that were destroyed. And so you'll literally see a plaque that says, Susie Bell's Cafe, destroyed in 1921, never reopened. However, these plaques now, they're literally in front of baseball stadiums and luxury apartment buildings. And so what are these plaques actually accomplishing? You know what I mean? If you're still going to take the land from the black people in that community, but you have a plaque there that tells you that something bad happened 100 years ago, what is that plaque actually doing? And so I think that's a huge issue that Tulsa has.
You don't think it really functions like the Stolpersteine in Germany?
Yeah, no, definitely not, because,
What do you see as the difference between kind of those plaques and the Stolperstein in Berlin?
Well, I think part of it is the fact that in terms of policy, black people in Tulsa never received reparations or any kind of financial restitution. So,
and the German government did do that.
Yeah, exactly. So in Tulsa they have plaques, and there's a new museum called Greenwood Rising that's a really kind of nice upscale museum, but the money raised for that was used for this function of memory making before they went to the steps of providing restitution to the people who were impacted. So I think they got the order backwards on that a little bit. You know what I mean? So I think that's just something I would caution everyone. I think these days, especially, black issues become really big business. So that Watchmen and Lovecraft and all this kind of stuff. But often, the people who are actually impacted by these events are not even involved in the, neither getting restitution, but not even getting money off of the entertainment products. So.
Well, I have one final question before we open it up to the audience for their questions. So you mentioned you live in Tulsa now, and you've lived there for how long?
About 3.5 years.
Yeah, 3.5 years. So I think you've seen how urban renewal, which I think James Baldwin referred to as Negro renewal, has affected the landscape. And now that you know that landscape intimately, and I do get a sense from reading this book that you really connected with this landscape, both the past and the present. How did your engagement with Tulsa as a place affect the story, or maybe shape the story in Built from the Fire?
Yeah, so I think I have kind of a creative perspective on that and a policy perspective. So on the creative side, the hardest part of the book to write by far was the actual chapters about the race massacre. There's 3 chapters in the book that go through everything that happened step by step, and it was just really hard to write. And actually for those chapters, I went on this hill called Standpipe Hill. There's a hill in Greenwood called Standpipe Hill where during the race massacre, a machine gun was set by the National Guard and used to fire down into the neighborhood. And if you're up there, you can see you can see everything in the community. And so I actually went up there and I wrote by hand my 3 chapters about the race massacre. And I've written anything by hand since I was a little kid, tooling around, hoping to be a writer one day, And so it really helped me, I think, to kind of go slower with it and really process what I was trying to convey. So that was sort of on the creative side, how being in Tulsa really impacted what I was able to create. I think on the policy side of things, I remember the first time I went to Tulsa and drove through North Tulsa, which is the black part of town, I was shocked about how empty it was. It was like so empty and desolate in some places. And I think sometimes there can be a tendency of people, even subconsciously, to think that the people here probably have something to do with that. Like the people here may have some role to play in why their community looks like this. But I learned in my research, actually, a lot of this North Tulsa was actually overwhelmingly white way back in the day. I had no idea. So Greenwood was this black neighborhood, but it was surrounded by white communities. Mr. Goodwin, Mr. Arredondo's sister Joanne told me that when she was a kid in Greenwood, her father told her, don't cross Cincinnati, because that's where the white folks were, and they were dangerous in some sense. And so then I sort of understood that, oh, actually, this is actually an overwhelmingly white space, and the white people abandoned North Tulsa en masse when Jim Crow ended. And there's stuff in the book about how black people were advocating for integration and equality. White people said, we're not going to have it. We'll go to South Tulsa and leave y'all up here. And so that really changed my perspective of what North Tulsa is. Once I understood that, in fact, there had been both policy reasons it looked like that, but also literally white people not holding up their end of the bargain about trying to create an equal society. And that's like why this case looks the way it is.
That part of Tulsa also gets redlined.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a mix of both policies and also individual families deciding they don't want to live near black people. And that's how you end up with a place that looks like that. And so I think that was really important for me, and I think important for people to understand about how communities are shaped. And getting away from the idea that, oh, it must be the fault of the folks here for some reason, why their neighborhood looks the way that it does.
So questions from the audience? Yes, Annette.
Fascinating story. Thank you so very much. My question is, when I think of Oklahoma, I think of Native America. It was long the motto on the license plates, Native America, Oklahoma, Native America. So how do Native communities at all figure into your story of Tulsa? Can you tell us a little bit more about it, or is that off the side of what you're reading?
Oh, no, that plays a very significant role. I knew very little about Oklahoma before moving there. But what I did know big from Alabama is that indigenous tribes were banished from my home state to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears. And so I thought it was extremely important for me to understand that background, that context, before I even begin to try to figure out Greenwood's story. And one of the things I discovered, which I had no idea about, was that the indigenous tribes actually owned black slaves before the Civil War. And there were enslaved people on the Trail of Tears with the indigenous tribes, actually. And after the Civil War, the tribes actually made these enslaved people members of the tribes. So they got like full autonomy in the tribes. They received acreages when land was sort of divvied up by the federal government. And that actually became kind of the nexus of black success in some ways in Oklahoma. There's actually a scene in the opening chapter of the book about they're called freedmen, the black people in these tribes. So one of these freedmen named A.G.W. Sango, Alexander George Washington Sango, what a name. And so Sango would try to recruit black people from the Deep South to come to Oklahoma. He said, hey, don't go to Chicago, don't go to Iowa, come to Oklahoma, that's where it's happening. And he actually recruited Jim and Miss Arredondo's grandfather, J.H. Goodwin, to come to Oklahoma. And I sort of have this in the book, this sort of alternate reality almost that the Goodwins entered because they met this member of the Native American tribe who brought them to Oklahoma and recruited them. So he really played a really significant role actually in shaping that black success in the state.
Any questions? Yes.
Can you talk about the motivating point when you decided I have to write this book? That's what I'm very interested in.
Nobody asked me that this whole time. So I wrote an article first for a website called The Ringer. So I used to be kind of a feature type writer. I'd write like kind of 5,000 word dispatches about different places that I went to visit. And when I went to visit for The Ringer to write this article, I read a little bit about Black Wall Street. I had certain sort of grand visions in my head about what it might be. And there wasn't much left. There's only two. There's the Eagle and there's two kind of older buildings that are there. The day I went, actually, though, there was a vigil happening. It was the 97th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so there was a vigil happening to commemorate that and the fact that people have been murdered on this land. But there were only about 30 people at this vigil. Meanwhile, there were hundreds of people in the neighborhood streaming to this baseball stadium that's in Greenwood. And so when I saw that dichotomy of like, oh, no one seems to care, even in Tulsa, no one seems to really care about this or acknowledge this, but they're all in Greenwood land going to this baseball game. That's what kind of what really, I guess, clicked in my mind that this needed to be excavated more deeply and in a way that Because you know that article is, you know, it was an internet article. It's faded from time. It's kind of almost gone from history now. But hopefully this book will last in a way that'll make people acknowledge and respect and remember Greenwood in a more permanent way.
Talk a little bit more about the handwriting process. Did you know you were approaching that chapter and said, I'm going to do it by hand? Or did you just happen to start writing and then kept going? Talk about that.
Sure. So actually, when I worked for The Ringer, I used to write these articles that were called oral histories. And so an oral history is almost like, it's almost like a movie script. So like, let's say we're going to an oral history of this event today. I might interview about 10 people in the room, and then you would be like, I thought it was cool when Victor said this, and I thought it was cool when Victor said that, and I was like scratching my nose at this time. So it's almost like a movie script that you write, and so I basically used National Guard reports, first-hand accounts from black residents, newspaper accounts, and I kind of, for every hour in the race massacre, I did like an oral history. So it's like 6 p.m. on May 31st. Here's what everybody said about that. It's 7 p.m. Here's what everybody said about that. So I almost had this like script that I could refer to. And I used that as sort of my basis of knowledge, you know? So from that I was able to write by hand because I kind of had the plot in my mind, if that makes sense. So it wasn't like it was just pure inspiration. I kind of had a very rigid system that I used. And through that I was able to sort of draw a more creative inspiration when I actually wanted to write by hand.
And you put that script in the computer?
Yeah.
And,
Yes.
and then you printed it out?
Yeah.
So you go, okay.
That's how it worked, yes.
Yes, gentleman here.
Thank you for the conversation. I have a lot of questions, but to save everyone's time, I'll just buy the book. Thank you for the residents that came by, and thank you for overdue posts on Square Books. I would not know about this page post on Square Books. I am a late bloomer, I suppose. The county and town I'm from wasn't deaf as opposed when it comes to race, but it was very much Martin Luther King happened, Rosa Parks happened, we don't have to worry about that anymore. As I got into college and learned and read more about the past, it bled into the present, and I saw more and more things happen. But there were people around me still that were either in denial that it was still going on, or that we are still in the aftermath of it, or there were those that were practically social gaslighting, essentially. Like, this isn't who we are, or it wasn't that bad, or over-exaggerating. In your research and in your writing, have you encountered denial and social gaslighting, and how have you combated that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the version of it I see that I kind of key in on is it's a different form of that. I think in terms of we're going to acknowledge what happened, but in a way that suits our aims. So, for example, when this Greenwood Rising Museum had its groundbreaking, there's a really big, fancy, expensive museum in the middle of Greenwood now that was sort of funded partially with state funds and sort of received endorsement from the city of Tulsa and the mayor and all these people. And so at the groundbreaking, the mayor of Tulsa was there, and he kept talking about, like, oh, people were murdered here, and that's what matters. And I just thought about that because I was like, well, if we're going to go through things through that lens, all the murderers are gone, so that means no one's going to be held responsible. You know, so if we say, oh, people were murdered, it's really bad, that sounds good, but that sort of almost absolves the city because there's no way they can punish the murderers because they're all gone. Whereas if we say, actually, the city of Tulsa is responsible, the city of Tulsa, the mayor 100 years ago literally was helping to orchestrate this scheme to take the Greenwood land. Chamber of Commerce was also involved in this scheme. The police literally said at the time that they deputized white citizens, gave them badges without knowing their names. The police said that some of those folks, quote, applied the torch. All this is documented. And so if we're going to talk about murder and that's it, and we know no one's going to be punished because they're all dead, you've almost absolved the city from their responsibility. So I kind of see it like that a lot often, where they're seemingly addressing the issue, but not. There's like a feint going on. And so I try to, as I can, sort of open people's eyes to some of those dynamics in Tulsa.
Other questions? Yes.
I just want to know, it sounds fascinating, what you are doing in Tulsa and how you, is this something permanent? What's next step for you?
A nap first. Then another nap. I'm very tired. I think right now my goal is to really get this story out to more people. So, for example, in the fall, I'm going to be going on an academic tour. I think that sharing this story with students is really important. And so that's like my first primary goal, is to make sure that just more young people can understand this. I was only 27 when I started working on the project, and so not that far out of college. And so I think it's a great opportunity to connect with some people from that generation about the story. And after that, I hope to write more books about Black history that kind of fill in the gaps. I feel like when I was a kid, Black people kind of disappeared from history between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. And talking about Rosa Parks and Dr. King, we were just kind of out of the picture. And so I knew nothing about Tulsa, Greenwood as a kid. And so I think there's so many stories about us in that 100-year span that have never really gotten their proper due or spotlight. So I'd hope to put more spotlight on those kinds of narratives.
I know you had a question?
Yes, it was because the response of... Yes, I have a question. You raised several things. I saw John W. Franklin say you name names. That was on the interview at the museum in D.C. I happened to watch that. And I was impressed that he would accuse you of naming names. And you agree right here in the public. Did you run across any role by Wiley Post or Will Rogers in the planning or the execution of that massacre?
So I did not have any sort of like documentation on that. I've heard stories about Wiley Post, but I didn't have anything specific. In terms of the names I was naming, it was much more kind of like police officials, government officials, real estate officials, people with sort of like specific roles of power in the community and how they executed on those roles in the time period of the race massacre. But I also think it's really important that the research continues, So I'm hoping that with me sort of putting forward this naming names methodology and approach, it would sort of encourage more people to dig further in the future.
There's a reason I asked that question. About a decade ago, I'm sitting in the presence of an old guy, 90, 95, born 3 years and 2 months after the massacre, 35 miles southwest of Tulsa. So he apparently learned about it backwards and forwards from time to time. Even from time to time, let me leave it at that. But he said that at some point, this was a number of years later, maybe after World War II, so around 1950-ish, like that, that this is a guy who was very high up in the Masons, nationally and regionally at the during the time, and the Prince Hall Masons. He referenced an acquaintance that he had with a well-known singer, a white singer from the South, who had connections in Tulsa, and who talked about a role that Wiley Post had. A colleague of mine once did some research, and Wiley had his own problems with the law, with justice, and a number of other things, just himself. But the conclusion that he reached, there was a period of time, about 3 weeks, when he was apparently let out of prison temporarily, apparently to do some work for some Tulsans. He was in prison not far from there. And at some later point was released completely. The question was that work related to the massacre, number one, but number two, I'm not asking you this, but this person. And number two, did his release signal that he had accomplished his work? And that was the only reason I asked. I mean, he was a pilot, of course, and Will Rogers was a friend of his, according to the history that I read about Oklahoma. So I was just wondering.
Okay.
I hope your research continues.
Yeah. Well, just to provide a little context, airplanes were used during the race massacre in Tulsa in 1921, and there's been a lot of effort to sort of pinpoint exactly how the planes were used. And for a long time, there was sort of an academic argument that, well, they couldn't have been used for dropping bombs because it was too early technologically. But actually, B.C. Franklin, the Smithsonian guy, mentioned his grandfather had a first-hand account that said that turpentine bombs were dropped on Greenwood. And so Wally Post was another person who may have been using an airplane to drop bombs on the community. And that's sort of the ongoing vein of research. Like, how are these planes used in Greenwood during the race massacre? It's one of those ongoing sort of academic strains that we're trying to understand more about.
Yes, one.
My voice doesn't eject, so I'm going to stand up. I met John Hope Franklin when he came to Oxford some 20 years ago, and he spoke at the university. And my husband at the time went up and to meet him, and he said to my husband, "So what do you do?" My husband said, "I'm a retired doctor. I play golf. I do this, that, and the other." He said, "Shame on you. You should be doing something more than that. The life you've been given, if you grew up in Oxford and retired successfully as a doctor, you should do more." And speaking of more, every time I think of Tulsa, Oklahoma, I think of what happened. And I travel a lot, and I've lived different places. Each time I go places, like if I tell people I'm from Mississippi, "Oh God, why do you live there?" It's still that, I love it here in Oxford, but it's still that perception of Mississippi like it was 100 years ago. It won't change in my lifetime. Why is that? Each state has something that's totally connected to it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm from Alabama, so I understand that sort of knee-jerk reaction people have, where they just assume that, so I'm from Alabama, and I moved to New York, and people there were just, they were amazed I didn't just get murdered in the streets living in Alabama. When in fact, like, sometimes in New York, there would be a lot more people assuming that I was, like, a bellhop instead of a hotel guest, or not giving me a cab, you know what I mean? So, like, I feel like people use that Southern stigma, or Tulsa stigma, to sort of get around their own mess in their own backyards, for sure.
Well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank you for coming to Oxford. I want to thank the Goodwin family for being here today, and everyone for coming out. And I wish you all the best in your continued research, and I can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank you so much, Ralph. I appreciate it. I mean, you're going to get your part of the I'm proud of you.